So we're going to move on to Pierre Corneille, a French, a significant French literary figure. He's a dramatist, a member of the Académie Française, which is in the concurrent with what is happening in England, of which we're well acquainted, or at least comparatively well acquainted because of the work of Milton and so forth. A great deal of English letters, the golden age of English letters is in the 16th century and the 17th century. And in the Republican period of English government, when Cromwell chops off Charles I's head and there's a interregnum there, Milton is writing his works, but at the same time on the continent, there in the court of France, which influenced Charles II, by the way. Charles II comes back with French ideas of artistic propriety and so forth, normed by Catholic sensibilities. This is problematic when Charles II comes back. He brings back aesthetic considerations that are then going to influence English letters as well. It's not just his Catholicism. There will be other influences, and one of the influences is of that simply of the Académie Française. And we'll find that in 18th century literature, Pope and Swift and Johnson, they are to some degree responding to the Neoclassicism that arises in France. And Corneille is a great representative of that. So that's why I'm looking at him here. Now, he's not doing it to curry favor with the royal establishment or the literary establishment, let alone the ecclesiastical establishment. He is a playwright primarily, and he's interested in the issues of good art. His most famous play, and this is significant, is to what we're going to read is called Le Cid, El Cid. And I think it's 1637, yes. Corneille. And in this, a whole critical fury arises here. The title is derived from the Arab word for Lord, by the way. And in his play, which is famously beautiful in the French language, so there's a saying around Paris at the time, beau comme le Cid. That's how beautiful the language is. So the language of Corneille is particularly beautiful, and the critics acknowledge this. But they say that there's a moral threat to the narrative that is presented, because there's a young woman who is torn between a sense of love for a man and her duty to her father, and he seems about to marry the man who's even killed her father. And this is portrayed on the stage. And the critics say that this offends our reason and our moral values, that a woman would even contemplate killing the man or marrying the man who killed her father. Like, that's presented in the play. And so the critics will appeal to the standards of classical decorum that are laid down by Aristotle and Horace, and the didactic function of the theater. We've already looked at both of those men. And there's a clear didactic function, and you are failing in your presentation here of something very beautiful, but which sounds intensely immoral. And you ought to adhere to classical standards here in your play's depiction. And chiefly, you ought to, in addition to that, adhere to the three unities. And that's the text that we're going to focus on, the three unities that Aristotle talks about when speaking of tragedy and the three unities. Now, these three unities, you've read Aristotle's text. They don't jump out at you. He doesn't talk about the three unities. But in the neoclassical age, they do talk about the three unities, and the three unities are of time and place and action. It ought not to be jumping here, there, and everywhere. It ought to be in one place. The action ought to take place over a 24-hour period. So look at Oedipus the King. It's all transpiring in a very brief span of time. And the actors are the same. We're not jumping from one place to the next like the Lord of the Rings, where we're here and then we're back here and we're over here. It's there. And they say that these unities are also ought to guide our a good play, ought to observe these things. It's not a significant emphasis in Aristotle, clearly, although he does mention it. But it's just there. And so authoritative is Aristotle in the period to everyone that even a classically trained author like Corneille is being accused of deviating from the norm. So neoclassicism appeals to a sort of normativity of the classical tradition and does it in a rather regulative fashion. So there are rules. You have to follow the rules. And out of that, there will even be a quarrel between the ancients and the moderns. And you can look this up. I'm not going to spend exceptional time here, but actually, I am going to talk about it in a minute. The quarrel of the ancients and the moderns, because everyone in this period recognizes the greatness of classical literature. Everyone. The question is, because the context here is the late 17th century, the scientific revolution, so-called, has just begun. And there are observations that in the realm of the sciences, following the Baconian method of inductive reasoning and so forth, there are new things being invented that the ancient world did not come upon. And so there's a sense, but there is a possibility of progress. And the sciences have showed the way. And the methodology of the sciences is something that perhaps we ought to consider in the field of the arts. Maybe we can make progress. Yes, the ancients are great, but perhaps the moderns are as well. And we're going to find this played out in not just in the Académie Française, but also in England. In England, there will also be a quarrel over how normative the classics are with respect to great art, and they will appeal to a sense of nature over art. And the chief representative of that, and this will be our third reading, I'm hopefully going to get to it today, now that my time is pressed, is Shakespeare. Because they say that, the critics will say that Shakespeare does not follow the rules of the three unities, for instance, of time, place, and action in his tragedies. He doesn't do that. And yet there's a greatness there. So what rule does he follow then if he doesn't follow the rules of art? And the answer is he follows nature. He follows his own nature. Now note that the reaction here is against the neoclassical period. It's not really against the classical period. The classical period is not going to hold to rules as regulative principles that you dare not deviate from. In fact, when we looked at Longinus on the Sublime, and this is one of the reasons Longinus on the Sublime was so influential, he says that the chief attribute that a great poet must have in creating sublime poetry is himself. He needs to have noble character. He needs to have great thoughts. Shakespeare possesses both of those. He has great thoughts and he has a noble character. He's a good man. Everything he sees is colored by that moral framework which he brings to all things. And he has a grand scope. And the other three attributes that Longinus speaks of are related to art, but that's of lesser significance than the poet's own nature. Now, once that push comes on nature as opposed to art, we're moving in the direction of Romanticism. And Wordsworth will appeal to the nature of the poet. He even talks about the nature of the poet explicitly in his character. That's never gone away. It's actually always been there. It's there in Longinus, but it's also there even in Horace. Horace talks about how some things simply can't be taught. There's a genius. Some people just seem to have something that other people can't give to them. Even those who are geniuses can't convey what makes them unique to other people. And that's, I guess, what makes them so influential. And yet, on the other hand, the tradition will say that we learn, and Augustine even says that on Christian teaching, that the way we become eloquent is by being in the presence of people who are eloquent. But that's not rules following. There's something more than that. And I've noticed this in the realm of all sorts of things. People who are exceptionally successful, people then try to copy it and follow the same thing, and they start to follow it in mechanical ways. Churches do this. Say, oh, yeah, this works, so now let's copy that and we'll franchise it. And all the churches will do exactly the same thing in exactly the same way, not because it's following scripture, but because it's following the pattern of a particular individual, and then it becomes a movement, and we're all following this fellow until the copiers demonstrate that they lack the thing that the man who originated the movement possessed, which they can't grasp because they're not him. And to some degree that is the quarrel here. So between the ancients and the moderns, which one of them is greater, or is it even possible for the moderns to excel beyond the ancients? That's the question. It's in Swift's The Battle of the Books, by the way, which I'm not going to read here, but that's about the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns. When he refers to the Battle of the Books, that's what he's referring to. So it's a quarrel that's going on in the French Academy and also in the English Academy after the demise of Cromwell's government and the coming of the restoration of the monarchy. So Corneille, in the mid-40s, is a master of the French stage, and he leads a group in a period which we call the Baroque. The word Baroque, which I don't know what you associate it with, whether it's art, as in painting, or whether it's music. It's usually one of the two. Not usually a literary term, however. We don't talk about Baroque literature. But we do talk about Baroque as a form of artistic extravagance. Generally, it refers to architecture, actually. The architecture in Spain and Italy. In France, where Corneille is writing, Baroque refers to extending the exuberance of the Renaissance. So it's a continuation of the Renaissance, and it's living in its exuberance, as it were. But it is sort of extravagant, based on energy, but also antithesis and exaggeration and transgressing boundaries, going beyond the boundaries. And that's what Corneille is doing in Le Cid, is he's transgressing the boundaries. A woman is torn between her father and her lover, and is to the extent where she's willing to marry her father's murderer. And again, the neoclassical critics say, they don't say that's immoral, they say that you're contradicting Aristotle. So, and therefore you're contradicting the principles of art. So now it becomes about art and not so much as this. But they do say that art has a didactic function. Note that they all agree on this. Why? Well, the whole tradition says that literature is there to teach and to delight and to move. As Augustine says, the movement is towards God, but all of it teaches and delights. The movement is pushing him anagogically. That's why Augustine adds the third part, to move. Not just to teach them, not just to delight them, but to move them. Now, Corneille emphasizes in his work here that his chief aim is to delight and not to teach. This is moving now in the direction of art for art's sake, which doesn't come full-blown until the 19th century. But this is why the French court in the 18th century is accused of decadence in its artistry and so forth, because it's just about beauty, and it's no longer about moral teaching. He does write 3 discourses, trois discours, responding to critics, quoting Aristotle directly, saying that the sole purpose of drama is to please the spectator, as I said. So now the emphasis is on delight. That's the sole purpose. And he demonstrates this desire to please the spectator will serve as what becomes his first axiom, which is the leading aim for all the others to follow. And the moralists of the 17th century, citing Aristotle, say that that infers didactic theater, and he parts ways from. So the moralists in the theater, who produce bad plays, by the way, unfortunately, and they almost all, those who emphasize the moral function of theater and ignore the beauty, often discredit their own case, because it is always both. You have to teach and to delight. The Corneille emphasizes the aim of delighting over and against the teaching. His counterparts, who are appalled by what he's suggesting here, go too far in the opposite extreme. And that leads to the same problem that Milton in the Puritanical period had as well, which is the theater then becomes it's only a teaching venue. Anyway, but the moralists will also cite Aristotle and argue that the classical conventions necessarily led to didactic theater, because it always teaches us something that therefore this is essential to the theater. So again, it's two people arguing a good case, but delegitimizing their opponents effectively when they both have a point. In the 3 unities of time, place, and action, which is in our text, which is he follows, this is the third of the 3 discourses. He uses examples from his own plays and quotes from Aristotle's Poetics, demonstrating that a good poet is actually a pragmatist that doesn't necessarily adhere rigorously to these prescriptive unities that his critics said have to be there. Now remember, his critics are trying to say, there's a line and you've crossed it. So where's the line? It's back in Aristotle. That's the line. You must not go beyond that line. But I'm going to skip over the rest of that because I need to move on to our next text, which is an application of this to some degree in the English sphere, the Anglosphere, Joseph Addison. Any comments or questions about this? But the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns is significant, and it does surround the question of, can we actually excel what the ancients did? I think the traditional answer has already been proven, and the answer is yes, because that's exactly what the Renaissance does, what Dante does. He adopts the epic to Christian theology, and while in a sense it would be totally wrong to say it's superior in its style, it's certainly not. It's certainly superior in the truthfulness of what it depicts, at least according to Christian theology and its insights into human nature. And I think those are actually demonstrable. It's not just a dogmatic assertion on my part, but that would take more time for me to go into. But anyway, we can see that in and we do this in first year English here, demonstrate how the epic evolves over the course of time and actually does demonstrate superiority. In fact, that becomes one of the conventions of the epic, is the attempt to outdo your predecessor. That's what Virgil does in citing Homer. Of arms and of a man I sing. Homer's 2 epics, I'm writing 1. He's writing about a man, I'm going to talk about the birth of an empire. Much greater topic. Dante is going to apply the Virgil's epic and say, how much greater is mine? Your poet, Virgil, gets close to the top of Mount Purgatory and he can go no further. Is there a better illustration of how far he's going to go above the Aeonian Mount of the pagans than that? No. Milton says the exact same thing. He's going to soar far above the Aeonian Mount and pursue things yet unattempted in prose or rhyme. So is it superior? Absolutely, at least according to those poets. So they are then firmly on the side of the moderns. The question then becomes, what is the indication of superiority? Because the Romantics will come around and write their epics that claim to be superior to Milton. And in what sense is their claim, on what basis is their claim made? How do we judge that claim? Those are questions also for literary theory. We'll come to the Romantics, maybe I'll come back to this. But let me talk about Joseph Addison now. Addison writing after Corneille's death, I believe. So he's born in 1672, dies rather early in 1719. He's certainly writing after Corneille. But can't be imagined without what's the developments that have taken place in the Académie Française, which exerts I would say, an unusually powerful influence on English letters like no other period. England and France have always influenced each other. The kings have sometimes swapped back and forth. Even Shakespeare depicts this in his plays. Sometimes the king of France is the king of England and vice versa. But here there's a significant influence. And in the extract we're going to look at something slightly different, but slightly tangential, but I think related. So we're going to look at Spectator number 62. The Spectator was a literary magazine journal that Addison wrote along with a man by the name of Steele. Both of them knowing each other from school days. They went to Oxford. In fact, if you go to Magdalen College where Lewis taught, there's they have huge grounds, but there's something called Addison's Walk there. But Addison is a good writer unto himself. He writes Latin verse, but he is more interested in politics, and he's more interested in impressing those in the aristocracy. And so he engages in aesthetics, and because in this period, the nobility are interested in the realm of literature. We're going to find Edmund Burke is doing exactly the same thing. So Edmund Burke is the great founder of conservatism as a political movement, but he cuts his teeth in a treatise on aesthetics early on. He tries to impress people in politics with his knowledge of aesthetics. Nobody would do that these days, to my knowledge, or even demonstrate an awareness of what's going on in the arts. It doesn't appeal much to the common man. It might if the poetry actually appealed to the common man, but it doesn't anymore. But that's another topic altogether. But he writes poetry and plays, but as I say, the literary collaboration with Steele is the thing that we're going to concern with here. This is a journal that appears quite regularly, periodicals, and they create a focus on what matters of interest to those who regard themselves as aristocrats and often have the titles of aristocrats, those who would seek to be the best. And in Addison's Spectator number 62, he's going to look at wit. I should have put this up. I don't know if I can even find this now. I probably can. Addison Spectator. Is it 62? There it is. Oh my goodness, yes, but it's too vast for this. Anyway, we'll put it up in the background. Oh, don't turn it off. That was a mistake. I'll give it a sec. Anyway, I'll speak and then maybe it'll come on in a second here. But he's looking at wit. And what does he mean by wit? In general, in English, we tend to refer to wit as just a type of humor. Somebody's witty. We don't actually use the word that much anymore. People don't even say, oh, that was very witty. I guess that's the extent of it, but I don't hear the word used much at all. But it would originally have been connected with a sense of a knowledgeable humor. And so from the German verb wissen, which is to know, a derivation of that is contained in wit. So it's a sort of a humor, a delightful turn of phrase, which nonetheless is predicated on something that is deeply understood. So to be witty is to be learned and humorous. Shakespeare will demonstrate it in his comedies. It's the aristocrats that demonstrate wit. The commoners, they have fart humor. It's Dumb and Dumber stuff, which is humorous. But again, it's not the sort of humor where we are looking at higher things. We're thinking more of lower things, carnal things, bodily functions, and so forth. The sort of things that will bring little schoolboys to laugh. Always have, always will. But don't lead them to think about what the commedia is. Remember the Divine Comedy? It's called the Commedia. What is the Commedia talking about? There's something delightful and even humorous, although there's not a lot in the Divine Comedy that brings you to laugh, but there's something about the joy embedded in creation. So in a broad sense, it's the natural ability to perceive and understand. It's keen intelligence. It's a quick and subtle perception, but specifically capacity to perceive and express relationships that are seemingly disconnected. But the writer can bring us to see them. And they're very much about cultivating this. Remember, this is not just post-Reformation, it's post-Puritan period. And the mark of the Puritans does not leave England. For all of their movement towards the Restoration and attempts to accommodate and sort of create a balance in the populace, we don't want to go to the extremism of the Puritans again. On the other hand, we need to grant to them, to keep them quiet, if only that there is an importance in developing wit and to be able to think deeply about things and present Christian truths in ways that will be appealing. Not hammer over the head things, but will draw people. This is not what today we could call people being winsome, which is some sort of stupid manner, just being pleasing in your demeanor. It's talking about language. It's not talking about somebody who's got the gift of the gab and is just able to flatter his audience into, thinking that what he's saying is great even while he's teaching terrible things. But he begins with this reflection on from John Locke. Mr. Locke has an admirable reflection upon the difference of wit and judgment, whereby he endeavors to show the reason why they are not always the talents of the same person. His words are as follows, and hence, perhaps, may be given some reason of that common observation that men who have a great deal of wit and prompt memories have not always the clearest judgment or deepest reason. For wit, lying most in the assemblage of ideas and putting those together with quickness and variety, wherein can be found any resemblance or congruity, thereby to make up pleasant pictures and agreeable visions in the fancy. Judgment, on the other hand, lies quite on the other side, in separating carefully one from another, ideas wherein can be found the least difference, thereby to avoid being misled by similitude, and by affinity to take one thing for another. This is a way of proceeding quite contrary to metaphor and allusion, wherein, for the most part, lies that entertainment and pleasantry of wit which strikes so lively on the fancy and is therefore so acceptable to all people. Now note that he talks about various terms that are going to come up again in Coleridge, which we've already looked about in the Romantics, and in appealing to the fancy, by which he's not distinguishing from the imagination either. That's a later development. Although I will say to you that Addison and Steele are already identifying the imagination as a preeminent faculty, and they follow Locke in this, actually, because it's Locke that gives a great deal of power to the imagination in bringing things together. But the difference of wit, he distinguishes it from judgment. And so what he will give to us to some degree is the capacity of witty poets or writers who are able to delight, like Corneille, from his critics who may have better judgment. Now, ideally, the poet ought to be a great critic and vice versa, but we will find that this is not always the case. Some people are magnificent at being witty, at drawing connections from between disparate things that other people would not have connected, and to bring us to smile, if not laugh, at the connections. And there's a learnedness about it, but it doesn't mean that they have thought deeply enough to judge soundly. And I would say that Wordsworth is a great illustration of this. Not that he's humorous, but that he has a sort of, there's a wit there, and yet I would say Coleridge possesses judgment, much sounder judgment than Wordsworth does. Wordsworth tries to do it and he fails to do it. The best are able to do both, and our final writer, Samuel Johnson, is one of those. He's a great poet, writer, and he is also the great critic of the 18th century, Samuel Johnson. But it's not always so. As I say, I think Wordsworth's a terrible critic, but I think he's a great poet. I think that Coleridge is also a great poet, actually, though probably lesser compared to Wordsworth, but he is a much sounder critic. And here we have the distinction between the two, and that there are some who are very witty or pleasing to the audience and apparently learned, like Corneille, who may yet lack judgment. So he's not talking about that. I'm making the connection just because we've just brought this up. But this is, I think, the best and most philosophical statement that I have ever met with, of wit, which generally, though not always, consists in such a resemblance and congruity of ideas as this author mentions. I shall only add to it, by way of explanation, that every resemblance of ideas is not that which we call wit, unless it be such an one that gives delight and surprise to the reader. So it has to give delight and surprise. So he adds that to wit. In other words, surprise, it adds a little bit of novelty to it. That's why we laugh. I never thought about that before. That's amusing. It's also, there's an insightful that. So to be witty is the great aim of the 18th century in many ways, the wit. It's even there in the 17th century, some would argue. When we come to the period that follows this, and we're coming quickly to that now, the Romantics, they don't care about wit anymore. And the Victorians, they're not interested in wit. They are interested in the imagination. The imagination eclipses all of the discussions here, but we're not there yet. Here they're concerned with wit, and you will find it in the satire of Swift and Pope and so forth, right? You've read some of Swift and Pope at any rate. And you can see that they're trying to present in delightful phrases the connection between disparate ideas, and yet there's a hint of novelty to it for all of its adherence to rhymed verse, rhyming couplets. By the way, in the 20th century, there's a backlash against the Romantics. I'll maybe talk about that in the next course. And a return of a praise for wit in T.S. Eliot and F.R. Leavis and Cleanth Brooks. And this is just the what they call the formalist movement. People often attribute it with formalism. They're going to want to pursue wit, a sort of a knowledge. The Romantics move away from that with their emphasis on the imagination. But I just say that by the by, we're not anywhere near that right now. Let me skip over that. So there's wit and then there's true wit. True wit generally consists in this resemblance and congruity of ideas. False wit chiefly consists in the resemblance and congruity, sometimes of single letters, as in anagrams, chronograms, lipograms, and acrostics, sometimes of syllables, as in the echoes and doggerel rhymes, sometimes of words, as in puns and quibbles, and sometimes of whole sentences or poems cast into the figures of eggs, axes, or altars. Nay, some carry the notion of wit so far as to ascribe it even to the external mimicry, and look upon a man as an ingenious person that can resemble the tone, posture, or face of another. But that's not what he means by wit. That's just superficial resemblances. That's not hinting at anything deeper than that. True wit consists in the resemblances of ideas, and false wit in the resemblances of words. So now there's the distinction. True wit points us to ideas. False wit is just language games where you, like in The Princess Bride, where the giant Fezzik and they're playing and they're, that, and they just keep rhyming. That's false wit. It's just play on words. I can find a rhyme for that. Well, that's funny, but that's not true wit. True wit will point us to an idea. Hey, that was a good illustration on the spot. Fezzik and whatever his name is, the Spaniard. Inigo Montoya, of course. Prepare to die. And now he mentions Cowley and Milton and so forth. Very interesting, because Coleridge will go back to these same individuals. Coleridge has read Mr. Addison and is engaging with him when he writes on this as well. So this kind of wit that appeals to ideas abounds in Cowley more than in any author that ever wrote. Milton had a genius much above it, however. Spencer is the same class with Milton. There's something here beyond an appeal to ideas in both Spencer and Milton, the two great poets of the English language, in my opinion. The Italians, even in their epic poetry, are full of it. Monsieur Boileau, who's going to be drawn into the Quarrel des Anciens et des Modernes, who formed himself upon the ancient poets, has everywhere rejected it with scorn. For which reason, Mr. Addison is going to be disparaging of Boileau and the French critics. If we looked after mixed wit among the Greek writers, we shall find it nowhere but in the epigrammatists. There are indeed some strokes of it in the fine poem ascribed to Musaeus, which by that, as well as many other marks, betrays itself to be a modern composition. This is not written by Homer at all, or any of his contemporaries. Anyway, but he goes on to this and talks about mixed wit. So this is an extended digression, or an extended look at just one word and the ideas connected with it, and how we disambiguate things that we call wit, which are not wit, and then there's true wit and false wit. Very characteristic of the 18th century. They are very interested in the connection between words and ideas. So much so that our next author, Samuel Johnson, will actually compose the very first English dictionary. So now we're getting away from, not away, but we're looking at one of the consequences of the biblical tradition is its transfer from Latin into the vernacular languages, and to some degree a sense of vocation on the part of the men of letters to connect words to Christian meanings and establish meanings, and to distinguish truth from falsehood, which is the provenance of the philosopher historically. to make just distinctions. Yes, but the poets are also called upon to do exactly the same thing, and Johnson becomes the great illustration of that. So I've got Spectator 62, True and False Wit. I think I also had On the Sublime, or did I get into the Sublime? I can't recall if I asked you to look at that. I'm going to skip over it anyway because we have already cut into him by taking a few minutes to look at Dante. I want to move to Johnson. Samuel Johnson. Let me put this on blank for a second. Samuel Johnson, roughly the same period as Addison. So Addison, what was the timeline again here? 1709. Oh, no, it's not. That's not it. Oh, I've skipped over Pope. That's why. Addison is writing it's from the 17th century. Oops, there it is. I'm always bad with these things. 1672 to 1719. Oh, I beg your pardon. So Addison's dead in 1719, 10 years after Johnson is born. So Johnson is writing in the great period of neoclassical scholarship in England. The great man of letters of the 18th century, without any doubt. His person is as famous as his letters in some ways. He's notoriously cantankerous. He's a grumpy old fellow. Witty in the best sense of the word. Notable for his aphorisms, those little short pithy phrases which pass into the English language and nobody acknowledges that they came from him. So for example, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. That's Johnson. Patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. Johnson. You might think they came from Shakespeare. They're not from Shakespeare. They're from somebody who wrote the life of Shakespeare. Johnson. A great man of letters. A dramatist. A writer of terrific essays. Johnson's essays are fantastic. If you want good style, look to Johnson. For English style, having said that, he uses the period as his role model, or his model for writing. He's not using the sentence structure. So you'll see, if you read any Johnson, that the classical period is what he has in mind in constructing his English prose. And I think the best English prose still follows that. It's just, where would you ever learn that? You're not really going to prize it. You imitate what's around you. People around us write sentences. And nowadays, they write sound bites or text messages, right? And it gets briefer and briefer in its utterance, and the thought that it expresses is less and less substantial. So we can't recover the intellect without recovering something of the style that contains the substance. At any rate, one of the great critics in English literary history, he writes this: the best part of every author, remember Wordsworth says that all true poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling? This is Johnson. The best part of every author is in general to be found in his book. Milton would say the same thing in his Areopagitica. It's sooner kill a man than kill his book, because it's the essence of the man boiled down. So don't be too quick to burn books or get rid of them or ban them or censor them. There may be a noble soul there whose nobility you've not yet recognized that would change your life if you understood him. Johnson has the same emphasis on the written word expressing something of the essence of the individual who writes it. Now, this emphasis leans in the direction of biblicism. Having said that, no Christian has ever gone and rioted when a Bible is burnt. So sacred writ is sacred because God himself speaks through it, but God's not contained in the book. And there's not a sense of, as I say this because in the Quran, if you desecrate a Quran, even sit on it, it's seen as an affront. Even if it's not deliberate, doesn't matter. We don't, that the Holy Writ doesn't mean the same thing there. But so there's a sense that the author is contained in the book. In other words, his character, his spirit is contained in the words of the book. And I think this is the case myself, and one of the reasons why we read the great books is because we're being acquainted with great authors, with great insight that far exceeds our own, and certainly that of our age. So, and by dint of the acquaintance of reading great authors, our own minds are expanded, and their discriminatory judgment is capable of giving us insights that we ourselves would otherwise have lacked, and certainly our age would never give us. Very interesting man. I'm going to skip over some of this. He produces an 8-volume edition of Shakespeare in 1765. This is shortly what is the French Revolution, 1789. So 24 years before the French Revolution. Johnson's a conservative, by the way, and he's also a monarchist. And he doesn't like Milton because of his republicanism, which is interesting. For him, there's a connection between your politics, your literary judgment, your aesthetics, and on and on and on down the line. So he's a firm Anglican, is Johnson. And Johnson and Milton, I wonder whether they would have got along. I think Milton, in his manner, is a far gentler spirit than Johnson. Johnson probably would have, it would have been an epic battle, all I can say. But he publishes an 8-volume edition of Shakespeare, which ignores the sonnets and the poems. And he reads the plays as literary texts to be read rather than as plays to be performed. And that he shares in common with the Romantics. So this is interesting. When Johnson comes to read Shakespeare, and I might have to pick this up next time, but I think I am going to have to. When the preface to his Life of Shakespeare, he's more interested in the words of Shakespeare than the plays of Shakespeare. And the mind of Shakespeare then is his chief aim, and he's moving in the direction of psychological criticism, which the Romantics express in full bloom. Even though he's the great neoclassical critic, he's moving away from a dramatic understanding of things. And he emphasizes Shakespeare's attention to character and his ability to reveal truths about human nature. So his psychological acuity is what Shakespeare already defends, and he defends him against the charges which are being made in the Académie Française and in the rule followers and in the moralists of violating the dramatic unities of time, place, and action. And also he mixes, shock, awe, tragedy and comedy. These are totally discrete branches of writing. The pagans, the Greeks never mix the two. There are comedies, there are tragedies. They don't mix them. Shakespeare mixes tragedy and comedy. Johnson defends Shakespeare in doing so, even though he moves away from the ancients. So he's weighing in on the side of the moderns. We're not bound by the rules. This sounds very much like a Romantic emphasis. And again, he will speak about his belief that, and this is a bit like Corneille, although he doesn't go in the direction of his aestheticism, that a great artist be granted freedom to depart from classical rules and prescriptions. Because there is a legitimacy to his own personal style here. But he appeals to the legitimacy of innovation. I only say that because when it comes to the 19th century, the Romantic critics, the great Romantic critics, and I'm chiefly thinking of Coleridge and Hazlitt here, will attack Johnson as basically precluding innovation, which he isn't. It's just that it has to, for Johnson, it has to flow out of a tradition. There has to be a connection between the present and the past. And we know the greatness of the present by its connection to the past, which is a point that T.S. Eliot will make as well. And tradition and the individual talent, that's Eliot's essay. We'll look at it next semester. He'll talk about how the individual great writer may be novel, but we know his novelty by comparison to the greatness of the past. But Hazlitt and Coleridge tend to push more strongly against that and away from that, for which reason there are many questions that arise there. But I'll maybe say a few words about this. I'm not sure if I will, but I'm going to think about his preface to Shakespeare, just noting a few things there briefly next class. Okay, but I am